Some people lose money and find despair. Others lose money and find the person who changes their life forever. The rain had finally stopped over Aurora, Illinois, leaving behind glistening streets and a chilly breeze that carried the familiar scent of wet pavement and engine oil. Daniel Brooks locked the doors of his small auto repair garage a little later than usual, wiping grease from his hands with an old shop towel before slipping it into his back pocket. At 39 years old, he had learned that life rarely rewarded hard work immediately, but every morning he still opened the garage before sunrise, and every evening he returned home knowing he had earned every honest dollar. His 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, was waiting for him with leftover macaroni and a math worksheet spread across the kitchen table, and that simple image was worth more than anything money could buy. As he crossed the nearly empty parking lot beside a grocery store on his way to pick up milk and bread, something dark caught his attention beneath a rain-soaked shopping cart. It was a leather wallet, expensive enough that Daniel immediately knew it belonged to someone whose life looked very different from his own. He picked it up carefully and looked around. The parking lot was almost empty except for a pickup truck idling near the exit and an elderly couple loading groceries into their sedan. No one seemed to be searching for anything. Daniel opened the wallet only far enough to identify the owner, and his heartbeat slowed for just a second before racing again. Inside were perfectly arranged stacks of crisp $100 bills. $50,000. More money than he earned in many months of repairing engines and changing transmissions. Behind the cash sat several platinum credit cards and a driver's license bearing the name Emily Harrison. Even Daniel recognized the name. Harrison Financial Group appeared regularly on local business news, and Emily Harrison was often described as one of Chicago's youngest and most successful CEOs. Before Daniel could even process what he was holding, his longtime mechanic, Mike, walked out of the convenience store carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Tell me that's not what I think it is," Mike said, staring at the thick wallet. Daniel quietly showed him the contents without saying a word. Mike's eyes widened. "Daniel, nobody saw you pick that up. Your mortgage is behind. Your truck barely starts. Sophie needs braces. This could fix everything." Daniel looked back at the rainwater shimmering beneath the parking lot lights. For one impossible moment, every unpaid bill flashed through his mind. The overdue property tax notice, the repair estimate for the garage roof, the school field trip Sophie had quietly said she didn't mind missing because she knew money was tight. The temptation wasn't imaginary. It was painfully real. Then his fingers brushed against a small family photograph tucked behind the driver's license. Emily Harrison stood beside an older woman, both smiling without cameras or reporters, just 2 people sharing an ordinary moment. Daniel closed the wallet gently and slipped it inside his jacket. "If I lost something this important," he said softly, "I'd pray someone like me found it instead of someone willing to keep it." Mike stared at him in disbelief. "You're walking away from 50 grand. Daniel smiled, not because the decision was easy, but because he already knew it was the only one he could live with. As thunder rumbled far beyond the horizon and the last drops of rain slid from the parking lot lights, he climbed into his aging pickup truck with one destination in mind: the headquarters of Harrison Financial Group. He had no way of knowing that returning a wallet was about to change far more than the balance of someone else's bank account. The following morning, downtown Chicago shimmered beneath a bright autumn sky as Daniel Brooks guided his aging pickup truck through streets lined with towering glass buildings that reflected the early sunlight like polished mirrors. He felt strangely out of place among luxury sedans and executives carrying expensive briefcases, yet he never considered turning around. The leather wallet rested safely inside the passenger seat, untouched since the night before. Every traffic light seemed to give him one last opportunity to change his mind, but with every mile, he became more certain that honesty was never supposed to feel convenient. Harrison Financial Group occupied nearly the entire lower level of a striking high-rise overlooking the Chicago River. The lobby alone was larger than Daniel's entire garage. Marble floors gleamed beneath elegant chandeliers, fresh flowers filled the air with a subtle fragrance, and employees moved with quiet confidence from one meeting to another. Daniel paused only long enough to wipe his boots carefully on the entrance mat before approaching the reception desk. The receptionist greeted him politely, although her curious eyes drifted toward his worn denim jacket and work boots. Daniel removed the wallet from inside his jacket and placed it gently on the polished counter. "I believe this belongs to Ms. Emily Harrison," he said calmly. The receptionist's professional smile immediately disappeared as she recognized the wallet. She reached for the telephone with trembling hands, speaking softly before asking Daniel if he would mind waiting a few moments. Less than 2 minutes later, the elevator doors opened, and Emily Harrison stepped into the lobby with purposeful strides. She wore a tailored navy business suit that reflected quiet confidence rather than extravagance, and although several executives followed behind her, she hardly seemed to notice anyone except the man standing beside the reception desk. Her eyes settled on the wallet before meeting Daniel's face. "Where did you find it?" she asked gently. "In a grocery store parking lot in Aurora last night," Daniel replied. "Everything inside should still be exactly where you left it." Emily opened the wallet herself, carefully checking the cash, identification, cards, and family photograph. Nothing had been disturbed. For several silent seconds, she simply stared at him, as though trying to understand something that numbers and business reports could never explain. One executive quietly whispered, "We should verify the amount," but Emily raised a hand without taking her eyes off Daniel. "There is no need," she answered softly. She reached into her assistant's folder, signed a generous company check within seconds, and extended it toward Daniel. "Please accept this. It is only a small thank you." Daniel glanced at the amount before slowly shaking his head. "I appreciate the offer, but I cannot take it." Emily looked genuinely surprised. "Most people would." Daniel smiled politely. "Maybe, but I was only returning something that was already yours." The silence that followed seemed to echo throughout the marble lobby. Several employees exchanged confused glances, unable to understand why someone facing obvious financial hardship would refuse such a reward. Daniel finally spoke again. "If you would not mind signing something saying I returned everything, that would give me peace of mind." Emily's expression softened even more. Instead of insisting, she signed a simple receipt acknowledging every item had been returned intact. Daniel folded the paper carefully into his jacket pocket, thanked her for her time, and quietly walked toward the exit without another glance at the check still resting on the reception counter. Emily remained standing exactly where he had left her, watching through the towering glass windows as his old pickup truck disappeared into Chicago traffic. Around her, meetings resumed and telephones rang once more, but somehow the busiest building she owned suddenly felt strangely quiet. For the first time in many years, the wealth she had spent a lifetime building seemed far less remarkable than the character of the man who had just driven away with nothing except a signed piece of paper proving he had done the right thing. Emily Harrison tried to return to her schedule, but the man who had quietly walked away from a generous reward refused to leave her thoughts. Every meeting that afternoon felt strangely unimportant. Financial projections filled the conference room screens, executives debated investment strategies, and assistants delivered neatly organized reports. Yet her attention drifted back to the old pickup truck disappearing into Chicago traffic. She had spent years learning how people reacted to money. Some negotiated for more. Others pretended not to care while hoping to be noticed. Daniel Brooks had done neither. He had simply returned what did not belong to him and asked only for written confirmation before leaving without hesitation. That evening, after the final meeting ended, Emily remained alone in her office overlooking the city. The lights of Chicago slowly illuminated the skyline as dusk settled across the river. She opened the security report from the lobby, not because she doubted Daniel's honesty, but because she wanted to know who he really was. His name appeared beside the visitor log, followed by an address in Aurora, Illinois. She hesitated for several moments before quietly closing the file. Curiosity was not usually something she allowed to influence business decisions, yet this felt different. 2 days later, on a quiet Saturday morning, Emily drove toward Aurora in a simple SUV instead of one of the company vehicles. She wore casual clothes, hoping not to attract attention. Following the address from the visitor record, she eventually found a modest repair garage with a faded wooden sign reading Brooks Auto Repair. It was smaller than she had imagined, but every parking space was occupied. She parked across the street and watched without stepping out. Daniel worked beneath the raised hood of an aging family sedan while speaking patiently with an elderly customer. Instead of rushing through the conversation, he carefully explained the repair in plain language. even showing the worn part that needed replacing. The older woman smiled with obvious relief before handing him the keys. A few minutes later, another customer arrived with a pickup truck making an unusual engine noise. Daniel listened quietly, inspected the vehicle, then surprised the driver by tightening a loose connection in less than 5 minutes. When the grateful customer reached for his wallet, Daniel simply smiled and shook his head. "It was only a loose cable," he said. "Drive safely." The man thanked him repeatedly before leaving. Emily watched in silence. She had expected professionalism, perhaps kindness, but not generosity that asked for nothing in return. Just before noon, a young girl wearing a bright yellow backpack ran toward the garage carrying 2 paper bags from a nearby bakery. Daniel's face transformed instantly. The tired mechanic disappeared, replaced by a father whose entire world seemed to brighten at the sight of his daughter. Sophie handed him a sandwich and proudly showed him a drawing from school. Daniel laughed warmly, crouching beside her so they could look at the picture together before gently brushing a strand of hair away from her face. They shared lunch on an old wooden bench outside the garage while autumn leaves drifted through the crisp afternoon air. There were no expensive restaurants, no luxury cars, no signs of wealth, only quiet happiness built from ordinary moments. Emily remained inside her vehicle longer than she intended, watching a life that somehow felt richer than many she had encountered among million-dollar boardrooms. As she finally prepared to leave, Sophie looked across the street for just a second, almost as if she had noticed the unfamiliar SUV. Emily smiled instinctively before driving away, carrying with her an unexpected realization that the most valuable thing Daniel Brooks had returned was not a wallet filled with money, but her belief that people like him still existed. The following Tuesday arrived with clear skies and the first crisp hints of autumn settling across northern Illinois. Brooks Auto Repair was already busy before 8 o'clock, and Daniel Brooks had spent the morning rotating tires, replacing brake pads, and answering questions from loyal customers who trusted him more than glossy advertisements. Just before noon, a sleek silver SUV rolled slowly into the parking lot. Daniel wiped his hands on a clean shop towel before walking toward the vehicle, expecting another routine repair estimate. When the driver's door opened, he paused for a brief moment. Emily Harrison stepped out wearing dark blue jeans, comfortable boots, and a light cream sweater instead of the tailored business suits he remembered. Without the polished boardroom surrounding her, she looked surprisingly approachable. "Good afternoon," Daniel said with the same calm courtesy he offered every customer. Emily smiled warmly. "I hope I am not interrupting your day." Daniel shook his head. "Not at all. What seems to be the problem with your vehicle?" Emily hesitated for a second before answering. "Honestly, I am not even sure there is one. I thought I heard an unusual sound yesterday." Daniel nodded without suspicion and carefully inspected the SUV. Nearly 20 minutes later, he closed the hood with a gentle smile. "Everything looks excellent. One small plastic cover underneath had become slightly loose. I secured it, but there is nothing else you need to worry about." Emily reached for her purse. "How much do I owe you?" Daniel smiled politely. "Nothing today. It took less than 5 minutes once I found it." Emily laughed softly. "You have a habit of refusing money." Daniel shrugged. "I only charge people when I actually fix something important." Before Emily could respond, the familiar sound of a school bus stopping nearby echoed through the quiet street. Seconds later, Sophie appeared, running toward the garage with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. "Dad," she called happily before slowing as she noticed the unfamiliar visitor. Daniel introduced them with a relaxed smile. "Sophie, this is Miss Harrison. She had a question about her car." Sophie extended her hand with surprising confidence. "Nice to meet you." Emily smiled and shook it gently. "It is very nice to meet you too." Sophie glanced toward the SUV before looking back at Daniel. "Did you already help her?" Daniel nodded. "Everything was fine." Sophie grinned proudly. "Dad always says fixing a small problem early keeps it from becoming a big one later." Emily looked at Daniel with quiet admiration. "That sounds like advice that works for more than cars." Daniel smiled, but said nothing. Instead, he helped Sophie carry her backpack inside the small office where homemade cookies waited in a glass container beside an old coffee maker. Sophie returned a minute later carrying an extra cookie on a napkin. She walked directly to Emily and offered it with complete sincerity. "Dad says guests should never leave hungry." Emily accepted it with genuine surprise. "Thank you. That is very thoughtful." As the afternoon sunlight filtered through golden leaves surrounding the garage, conversation became unexpectedly easy. Emily asked Sophie about school, her favorite books, and the science project she was excited to finish before the county fair. Daniel listened quietly, occasionally smiling as his daughter enthusiastically described every detail. Time seemed to slow beneath the warm autumn light. There was no mention of business, no discussion of money, and no reminder of the wallet that had brought them together. When Emily finally prepared to leave, she paused beside her vehicle and looked back at the modest garage, the father locking away his tools with practiced care, and the little girl waiting patiently beside him. For reasons she could not yet explain, driving away felt much harder than arriving, and for the first time in years she found herself looking forward to a reason, any reason at all, to come back. Over the next several weeks, autumn settled comfortably over Aurora, painting the neighborhood with brilliant shades of amber and crimson while life continued at its familiar pace inside Brooks Auto Repair. Emily Harrison found herself inventing perfectly reasonable excuses to stop by the garage. Sometimes she claimed she wanted a second opinion about a faint vibration that had already disappeared. Other times she asked Daniel to explain basic maintenance she could have easily learned from the owner's manual. Daniel never questioned her reasons. He simply treated her with the same quiet respect he offered every customer, never asking about her company, her wealth, or the world she came from. Little by little, conversations that had once lasted only a few minutes stretched into half an hour over fresh coffee brewed in the tiny office beside the repair base. Sophie quickly became the bridge neither adult expected. Every afternoon after school, she eagerly showed Emily another drawing, another library book, or another science experiment she hoped to build for class. Emily listened with genuine interest, discovering that the happiest moments of her week no longer happened inside boardrooms, but beside an old wooden workbench covered with tools and children's crayons. One chilly Friday afternoon, however, reality reminded Daniel that honesty alone could not pay every bill. After closing the garage, he opened a plain white envelope left in his mailbox. His expression slowly changed as he quietly read the notice. The bank was reminding him that 2 overdue mortgage payments needed immediate attention. He folded the letter carefully before placing it back into the envelope, just as Sophie skipped into the kitchen asking whether they could decorate the front porch for the upcoming fall festival. Daniel smiled warmly and promised they would do it together the next evening. He never mentioned the letter. The following Monday, Emily arrived unexpectedly with homemade muffins from a bakery she claimed to have discovered on the drive from Chicago. As Daniel poured coffee, the mortgage envelope slipped from beneath a stack of repair invoices onto the office floor. Emily instinctively bent down to pick it up before noticing the official bank logo on the front. She handed it back without reading anything else, but Daniel understood that she had recognized exactly what it was. There was a brief silence between them before Emily spoke carefully. Everyone needs help sometimes. Daniel looked out through the garage door, where sunlight reflected across parked cars waiting for service. That may be true, he answered gently, but help should never cost someone their independence. Emily shook her head softly. Accepting kindness does not make anyone weak. Daniel smiled with quiet gratitude. I know, but I need Sophie to grow up believing her father stood on his own feet whenever he possibly could. If one day I cannot, then I will ask without shame. Today is not that day. Emily admired the calm certainty in his voice. She realized he was not rejecting her generosity. He was protecting something far more valuable than pride. He was protecting the example he wanted his daughter to remember for the rest of her life. Before leaving, Emily quietly purchased gift cards from several local businesses and anonymously arranged for them to sponsor school supplies and library books for the elementary school Sophie attended, making certain no one could trace the donations back to her. She never told Daniel. She knew he would have politely refused if the kindness had been directed toward him. But as she drove back toward Chicago beneath a sky glowing with the colors of late autumn, she found herself wondering how much longer two people from completely different worlds could continue walking separate paths when every quiet act of kindness seemed to bring those paths closer together. The first snow of the season arrived earlier than expected, covering the streets of Aurora with a quiet blanket of white that softened every familiar corner of the town. Inside Brooks Auto Repair, The cold weather brought a steady line of customers preparing their vehicles for winter. Daniel Brooks worked from sunrise until long after dark, grateful for every honest job that came through the garage. He never complained about the long hours because every repaired engine meant another step toward catching up on the mortgage payments that still weighed heavily on his mind. One Monday morning, a large white envelope arrived by certified mail. Daniel opened it between appointments, expecting another reminder from the bank. But instead, he found an official invitation announcing a competitive request for proposals to maintain an entire fleet of corporate vehicles across northern Illinois. The contract was worth more than any project his small garage had ever considered. Attached to the invitation was a detailed list of qualifications, deadlines, and inspection requirements. Daniel quietly read every page twice before placing the documents inside a clean folder. Mike looked over his shoulder with disbelief. "This is the opportunity we have been waiting for," he said excitedly. Daniel smiled carefully. "Only if we earn it." Later that afternoon, Emily stopped by the garage carrying 2 cups of hot coffee after finishing a meeting nearby. Daniel thanked her and casually mentioned the invitation resting on his workbench. Before he could say anything more, Emily noticed the company logo printed at the top of the documents. Her expression changed almost instantly. Harrison Financial Group was one of several corporations participating in the regional fleet program. She understood immediately that if Daniel submitted a proposal and anyone discovered they knew each other, people would assume she had influenced the decision. Daniel recognized the concern in her eyes before she even spoke. "I did not know your company was involved," he said calmly. Emily nodded. "Neither did I until now." A quiet silence settled between them while the sound of an impact wrench echoed from the repair bay. Finally, Emily took a slow breath. "Daniel, I want you to promise me something." He looked at her with patient curiosity. "Promise that if you decide to apply, you will never ask me for help. Not because I would refuse, but because I do not want anyone questioning what you have worked so hard to build." Daniel answered without hesitation. "I was never planning to ask." Emily smiled, relieved but also deeply moved. "I knew you would say that." Daniel closed the folder and placed it back on the shelf. "If my garage is good enough, the work will come. If it is not, then I still have customers who trust me. Either way, I will sleep well." Emily looked around the modest garage once again. The old heater rattled softly in the corner, fresh snow gathered outside the open service door, and Sophie sat at a small desk finishing her homework while occasionally looking up to wave at them. It was an ordinary afternoon, yet somehow it carried the weight of a life-changing decision. Before leaving, Emily knelt beside Sophie and admired the winter drawing she had just finished. Across the top of the page, Sophie had carefully written in colorful letters, "Doing the right thing always brings you home." Emily felt her eyes linger on those simple words longer than she expected. As she drove back toward Chicago through gently falling snow, she silently resolved to remove herself completely from every discussion involving the fleet contract. She wanted only one outcome. If Daniel Brooks ever won the greatest opportunity of his life, the victory had to belong entirely to him, because the greatest reward for quiet dignity could never be a favor. It had to be respect earned beyond every doubt. The weeks that followed tested Daniel Brooks in ways that had nothing to do with repairing engines. Every evening after closing the garage, he stayed several extra hours preparing the proposal for the regional fleet contract. He carefully reviewed maintenance schedules, calculated labor costs, estimated parts inventories, and organized years of customer testimonials into a professional presentation. Sophie often sat across from him at the small office desk, doing her homework while quietly watching her father rewrite pages until every detail reflected the same honesty he brought to every repair. "Dad," she asked one evening, "do you think they will choose your garage?" Daniel smiled without looking up from the paperwork. "I do not know, sweetheart. All I can do is give them my very best." She nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like winning already." Her simple words stayed with him long after she had gone to bed. Meanwhile, Emily Harrison honored the promise she had silently made to herself. Whenever the fleet contract appeared on meeting agendas at Harrison Financial Group, she excused herself before discussions began, leaving complete authority to the independent evaluation committee. Several executives questioned her absence, but she simply explained that avoiding even the appearance of favoritism was more important than participating in a single business decision. Quiet integrity, she had learned, required sacrifice from everyone. A few days later, Daniel drove to Chicago to submit his proposal in person. The lobby of the evaluation center was crowded with representatives from large automotive service companies wearing tailored suits and carrying glossy presentation folders. Daniel arrived wearing his cleanest plaid shirt beneath his familiar denim jacket, carrying a neatly organized binder that showed signs of careful use rather than expensive printing. As he waited his turn, two competitors glanced toward him before quietly whispering to one another. One smiled politely but said loudly enough to be heard, "Looks like even neighborhood garages think they can compete now." The other chuckled softly. Daniel simply returned a courteous nod and continued reviewing his notes. He had spent too many years teaching Sophie that respect was never something to be demanded. It was something to be practiced. Inside the interview room, the independent panel asked detailed questions about staffing, emergency response times, equipment capacity, and quality control. Daniel answered each question honestly. When asked whether his garage could realistically handle a contract larger than anything he had managed before, he did not exaggerate. "Today, no," he admitted calmly. "But I have already prepared a hiring and training plan that grows only as the workload grows. I would rather promise less and deliver more than promise everything and disappoint you." Several committee members quietly exchanged thoughtful glances before moving to the next question. Days passed without any news. Winter settled more deeply across Illinois, and Daniel returned to his ordinary routine of helping customers, clearing snow from the driveway before sunrise, and sharing quiet dinners with Sophie. Emily resisted every temptation to ask about the evaluation process. She understood that even innocent curiosity could place an unfair shadow over Daniel's efforts. Then, one snowy afternoon, an unexpected call arrived at the garage. It was not the committee announcing a decision. Instead, they requested a final on-site inspection of Brooks Auto Repair. Daniel thanked the caller and calmly wrote down the appointment time before hanging up. Mike could barely contain his excitement. Sophie clapped her hands and hugged her father. Daniel simply looked around the small garage that had carried him through years of honest work. Nothing about the building was luxurious, but every tool was organized, every repair record was complete, and every promise to every customer had been kept. As fresh snow drifted quietly beyond the garage door, Daniel realized the inspectors would soon see far more than a repair shop. They would see the character that had been built inside it, one ordinary day at a time. The inspection day arrived beneath a clear winter sky, and Brooks Auto Repair looked exactly as it did every other morning. Daniel Brooks refused to stage the garage for appearances. The floors were clean, every tool rested in its proper place, customer records were carefully organized, and fresh coffee waited on the small counter beside a plate of homemade cookies that Sophie had insisted on baking the night before. "If people are coming to see who we really are," she had said with a smile, "they should see everything." Daniel had laughed softly, realizing once again how much wisdom could fit inside an 8-year-old heart. Shortly after 9 o'clock, 3 members of the Independent Evaluation Committee arrived carrying clipboards and inspection folders. They introduced themselves politely before beginning a thorough review of the facility. Daniel answered every question with complete honesty, never exaggerating the capabilities of his shop and never attempting to hide its limitations. When one inspector asked how he would manage a sudden increase in workload, Daniel presented the hiring and training plan he had carefully prepared weeks earlier. Another inspector reviewed maintenance logs from previous customers and noticed something unusual. Every repair recommendation included detailed notes explaining whether work was urgent or could safely be postponed. "You could have earned more money by replacing these parts immediately," the inspector observed. Daniel smiled calmly. "Probably. But customers remember honesty much longer than invoices." The committee members quietly continued taking notes. While the inspection moved through the repair bays, an elderly woman slowly drove into the parking lot with a sedan Daniel recognized immediately. He greeted her warmly and listened as she explained that a warning light had appeared during her drive to the grocery store. One committee member stepped aside, expecting Daniel to postpone the appointment until the inspection ended. Instead, Daniel excused himself politely, connected a diagnostic scanner, and discovered that the issue was caused by a loose sensor connection requiring only a few minutes to correct. When the grateful customer reached for her wallet, Daniel smiled and shook his head. "You have already paid me enough over the years by trusting this garage," he said. "Drive safely, and if the light comes back, we will look at it again." The inspectors exchanged quiet glances without saying a word. They had just witnessed the same integrity they had been reading about in customer testimonials. Later that afternoon, after every checklist had been completed, the committee thanked Daniel for his time and prepared to leave. Their expressions revealed nothing about the final decision. Life quickly returned to normal. Daniel swept the garage floor, closed repair orders, and helped Sophie finish a model bridge for her science class. He refused to speculate about the outcome because he believed worrying could never improve tomorrow. Meanwhile, inside Harrison Financial Group, the independent committee presented its recommendation to the executive board. Emily Harrison attended the meeting only after the evaluation had officially concluded and all scoring had been finalized. The chairperson stood before the room with a quiet smile. After reviewing every proposal, every financial projection, every facility inspection, and every customer satisfaction record, the committee reached a unanimous decision. Emily remained perfectly still, determined not to reveal even the smallest hint of hope. The chairperson placed a single folder on the conference table. Brooks Auto Repair received the highest overall evaluation. For a brief moment, complete silence filled the room. One executive finally broke the quiet by asking what had separated a small independent garage from several nationally recognized competitors. The chairperson answered without hesitation. Their equipment was excellent. Their planning was realistic. Their customer records were exceptional. But above everything else, every piece of evidence pointed to one conclusion. We trusted the character of the man leading that business. As the meeting continued around her, Emily lowered her eyes for just a second and smiled to herself. Somewhere in Aurora, Daniel Brooks was probably finishing another ordinary repair, completely unaware that the quiet dignity he had practiced every single day had just become the greatest qualification no business resume could ever fully describe. Nearly 1 year later, Brooks Auto Repair no longer looked quite the same, yet it had never lost the spirit that made it special. A second service bay had been added beside the original building. 2 young mechanics now worked alongside Daniel Brooks, and a modest fleet of service vehicles carried the garage's name throughout northern Illinois. The regional maintenance contract had brought steady growth, but every improvement had been made one careful step at a time. Daniel still greeted customers personally each morning, still explained every repair in plain language, and still refused to recommend work that was unnecessary. The values that had earned trust had never changed simply because success had arrived. Sophie, now 1 year older, proudly rode her bicycle through the expanded parking lot after school before settling into the familiar office corner to finish her homework. The old coffee maker remained on the counter, and homemade cookies still greeted every visitor who walked through the front door. One crisp spring afternoon, a familiar silver SUV quietly pulled into the driveway. Daniel looked up from beneath the hood of a customer's truck and smiled before Emily Harrison had even stepped outside. She was dressed simply in a light blue sweater and jeans, looking far more comfortable than she ever had inside a corporate boardroom. "You are becoming one of my most loyal customers," Daniel teased gently. Emily laughed. "My vehicle is perfectly fine." Daniel raised an eyebrow with a knowing smile. "That is what I suspected." Sophie hurried outside, carrying 3 paper cups filled with fresh lemonade she had prepared herself. "I made enough for everybody," she announced proudly. Emily accepted the cup with genuine gratitude before the 3 of them settled beneath the shade of an old maple tree beside the garage. For a while, they simply watched customers come and go while a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass through the neighborhood. There was no urgency to the conversation because none was needed anymore. Finally, Emily reached into her handbag and removed a carefully folded piece of paper that had become slightly worn at the edges. Daniel recognized it immediately. It was the signed receipt acknowledging the return of the wallet from nearly a year earlier. Emily smiled softly as she unfolded it. "I have kept this ever since that day." Daniel looked at the paper with quiet surprise. "Most people would have thrown it away." Emily gently shook her head. "It reminds me that one honest decision can change more than one life." Daniel remained silent for a moment before smiling with the same quiet humility that had first caught her attention. "I thought I was simply returning something that did not belong to me." Emily looked toward Sophie, who was laughing while chasing butterflies across the grass, then back at Daniel. You returned something else that day. He tilted his head slightly. What was that? Emily answered with calm certainty. You gave me back my faith that character still matters. The afternoon sunlight settled warmly across the garage, while neither of them felt the need to say anything more. Their friendship had grown naturally through ordinary days, shared conversations, and countless quiet acts of respect. It had never been built on wealth, opportunity, or obligation. It had been built on trust. As the sun slowly lowered beyond the trees, Sophie ran back toward them and reached for both of their hands without thinking. Daniel looked at Emily, and she smiled in return, understanding the simple gesture better than any speech ever could. In a world that often measured success by numbers, titles, and possessions, the greatest reward had arrived without fanfare. A father had remained faithful to his principles. A woman had learned that integrity could not be purchased. And together, they discovered that the strongest foundations are built not by extraordinary moments, but by ordinary choices repeated with quiet dignity every single day.